You're listening to the best of American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
I can't live without you, I can't live without you, baby, baby.
The highway won't hold you tonight. The highway don't know you're alive.
Welcome back to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. I'm the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. This week, we remember with great sadness the Boston bombings that occurred last year, which claimed 3 lives and also injured 260 people. And much of the conversation this week has also been about what have we learned, where do we go from here to ensure that something like this never happens again? Well, I think that it's quite easy to solve the problem of Muslim extremism in America if we have the courage to do so. And my approach would be very, very simple. The first would consist of vigorously affirming our national identity at every turn, especially when it comes to confronting those Muslims who admire or who seek to expand the practice of Sharia law. This week, I thought Reverend Franklin Graham very brilliantly stated how muscular we have to be in confronting those who want to bring Sharia law here. Roll it, Brittany.
Well, we should be afraid of Sharia law. We should be absolutely afraid of it. No question about it. Because there's no tolerance in Sharia law, and it persecutes those that do not believe in Islam. And I would say to Muslims in this country, if they want to practice Sharia law, go back to where you came from, to those nations that recognize Sharia law. But we have our own laws here.
Exactly. So none of this politically correct, namby-pamby, try to appease those who are fervent adherents of Sharia law or who espouse in any way, shape, or form an extreme view of the Muslim faith. So affirming our national identity to those who are here and affirming that our identity and our way of doing things, we believe, is actually superior to theirs. That's the kind of self-confidence it takes in order to eradicate this burgeoning muscular Muslim extremism that seems to be lurking in the darkness amongst us. Another thing, too, we need a moratorium on all immigrants from Muslim nations. I don't care how draconian this sounds, but if I had the power to do so in order to protect this nation, I would say there isn't going to be another Muslim who enters this country until this problem of extremism around the world is rectified, is solved. And some would say, well, aren't you punishing those who just want to come to America because they want a better life? I'm sorry. I have 2 options here. Either I punish you or I punish the next victim at another Boston Marathon or somewhere else in this country. Who do I choose? Well, I stand with the American people. Our objective is to protect our people first, and we have to do what is necessary to achieve that goal. So I would say no more immigration from any predominantly Muslim nation, period. And the message we would be sending to all the Muslim nations, especially to those people within those nations who are moderate, is get your act together. Clean house. Clean up this extremism in your midst. And number 3, the next thing that I would do is I would support this initiative that I was so thrilled to read about this week in the Wall Street Journal. There's a group called, it's a Muslim advocacy group, and they are called the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And the president of this organization has said, we need to be very vigorous in rooting out extremism in our communities when we see it. He's really very eloquent when he says this. This question is always framed as, why do we have to apologize for something that has nothing to do with us? So he's basically talking about those Muslims in the communities that say, look, I'm a peace-loving person. Why do I have to apologize for the extremists? And the president's response is, the president of this organization, we're saying that you have to take responsibility, that there are Muslim extremists out there and that they make it worse for all of us. Bingo. So Muslims in America have to take responsibility for the extremism that percolates in their communities. And how do they do that? Well, this organization wants to launch a program. It's called Safe Spaces Initiative. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to galvanize the community whenever they see somebody that seems like they're going down the road of extremism. If you look at the Tsarnaev brothers, one of them, for example, had several outbursts in a mosque. An incident like that, how did they respond to that? They just told him, look, if you make these outbursts again, you're not welcome here anymore. Instead, this program would say, wait a minute, when somebody is making an outburst that seems very bizarre, that seems out of place, that seems like there's a lot of violence or rage or unsettled behavior, that's a red flag. And what should be done is that the leaders of the mosque should stage an intervention right away. These programs are in place in our schools already. You see some kind of strange behavior, you don't just ignore it, and you don't just ignore the student. You stage an intervention. You bring the student in. You talk to that student. You talk to the parents. You talk to the relatives. You talk to the friends. Remember this too, that Muslim family members who have a young person that goes down the road of jihad, they end up suffering the terrible loss too, the loss of a brother, the loss of a son. They end up suffering immensely. And so a program like this is meant to say, wait a minute, if you have a brother, a cousin, a sister, somebody in the community that you see is acting strangely, these are the steps you need to take to pull them back from the brink of possible violence. Yes, we need to have those programs in place. And what that does is it also sends a message, a strong message to the Muslim communities within the United States. Look, you're going to have to help us fix the problem. You're going to have to help us clean up the mess. And you should do it, not just because it's morally right to do it, but also because your community suffers if you don't help us. And I want to relate a very, very personal story just to bring this point home. My very best friend is an Italian woman that I met in Washington, D.C. She came from Italy to work in a company in D.C. And during her years here, she fell in love with a practitioner of the Muslim faith, somebody from Morocco. She ended up marrying him. So because she's my best friend, I'm very close with him now and their beautiful little daughter. And I have talked very candidly to him. Now, he's a peace-loving person. He just came to America to make a better life for himself. And I'll never forget the night that we sat down, and I'll never forget these words. He said, Osama bin Laden ruined my life. I think this is important for a lot of Americans to hear because those Muslims who don't want to partake in violence, they are nonetheless smeared by it because willy-nilly there's a certain prejudice that percolates in American society when you see Muslims. And how could it be otherwise? How is everyone else supposed to know who's the peace lover and who's the next jihadist? So everybody is invariably smeared with that brush. So he who is a peace-loving person has conveyed to me, look, he's viewed upon with great distrust. He's viewed upon with suspicion. He's not going to have the same standing in this country as he could have had before 9/11. And that's very tragic for him. And it's very tragic for all the other Muslims just like him who literally came to this country to improve their lot, like the Italians, like the Irish, like every other immigrant group. So a program like this is in the best interest of the Muslim community. You need to stage these interventions if you see that. And you need to also, I would even go further than that, not just staging the interventions, but I would actually galvanize these communities to talk to the youth about the dangerous road they would go down for themselves if they pursue the path of jihad. The destruction that this brings, not only in their own lives, which obviously they're expecting because they think they're going to be martyrs, but the destruction that it brings to their family, to their relatives, to the larger community, to the reputation of their faith too. if you truly want people to come to a faith of their own free will, the last thing you want to do is smear it with this kind of a brush that it is linked with some of the most heinous acts on earth. And so I think that the youth who are truly idealistic, that truly have a fervent love of the Muslim faith, in order to prevent that from spilling into jihad and violence, the intervention should be not just for those who seem to be going down that road, that seem unstable or seem to just have embraced jihadist ideology, but even to talk to the youth way before they even approach that. So I would do that, and I think you would solve the problem in this country. Very, very simple. Affirm our national identity, a moratorium on all immigrants from Muslim nations until the problem of jihadism worldwide is truly under control. And finally and lastly, vigorous intervention in all Muslim communities by Muslims themselves. And there you have it. No more Boston bombings. You're listening to Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com, upholding values that are never, ever going to die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
You're listening to the best of American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Got a call from an old friend, we used to be real close.
Welcome back to American Heartland with Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. Well, as we look towards the 2014 elections, the GOP has a rallying cry, and that is fire Harry Reid. He is the Senate Majority Leader that has been a chief champion of the policies of President Barack Obama on Capitol Hill. And now the GOP wants him out. And they want to take over the Senate. And one of the things they're going to do is they're going to throw everything at Senator Harry Reid, especially showing how he has used his position in an unethical manner. He, by the way, is a 5-term incumbent. That's how long he's been there. He's had a long political career. And this week, there's a fascinating article out. It's by Adam O'Neill, and it's called Harry Reid's Long, Steady Accretion of Power and Wealth. The GOP is going to use every little bit of information in this article. What does this article tell us? It tells us that, and it proves it, it shows it, that Harry Reid used his position in the Senate to enrich himself with very questionable land deals. So he's been involved in a long string of unethical behavior. That's why this week the RNC chairman, Reince Priebus, referred to him as, quote unquote, dirty and unethical. And they're going to use this to galvanize the GOP to oust him, not only to stop Obama's agenda, but also they're personalizing it. We want to get rid of this specific individual who is a symptom or who symbolizes everything that's wrong with Capitol Hill today. Everything was wrong with the way Congress is operating. You know, in my years in Washington, D.C., I gained a tremendous amount of insight into how the political process works, but also how everything around the political process works. And I want to share some thoughts. Washington, D.C. attracts the best and the brightest around the country. In Washington, there are tons and tons of really smart people. They occupy all the think tanks. They come for the lobbying jobs. They come for positions on Capitol Hill. They are, by and large, smart, capable, highly educated, and extremely ambitious. If there's one word that I would use to describe the people I met in D.C., it is ambitious. By and large, they're mostly careerists. They're out to make a name for themselves. Yes, you do have a few that go because they are idealists, but mostly what I saw there were people who were extremely ambitious, out to enrich themselves or out to make a grand career. Either money or power is what drives them. And I can tell you this story. My girlfriends and I would often sit around and talk about the scene in Washington, D.C., some of us being married, some of us being single. But we all noticed one thing. We noticed that the men don't flirt. And we asked ourselves, well, why is that? And the more we analyzed it, we realized if there's a really good-looking woman that passes in front of a group of men in Washington, D.C., and there's also a television screen with Fox News or CNN on it, the men are more likely to keep their eyes glued on Fox News and CNN to find out what the latest tidbit of political information is rather than to turn around and look at that good-looking girl. In every other state in the United States of America, if there's a very good-looking girl that passes by, they will look at this good-looking girl. And one of the things we realize is when you leave Washington, D.C., the dynamics between men and women are the same. But in D.C., everything, even the most natural, primitive instincts of the genders are thwarted by an ambition that eats, destroys, devours everything in its path. So much so that it leaves nothing. So if I summarize my years in D.C., I met lots of intelligent people who were extremely uninteresting. Uninteresting because of that ambition that corrodes them. Essentially, when you meet many people in D.C., they look at you not like you're a human being that has a soul, that has some cultural contribution to make in conversation with them. They look at you, and you can see in their eyes, sharkish eyes, asking, how can I use her? How can I find out who she knows and take advantage of that to advance myself in some way, shape, or form? And this is a mindset that was prevalent in journalism, in academia, and in political circles. So much so that I created a nickname for everybody in D.C. I called them the mutants. Often my husband would say, how was your day? And I would say, well, the mutants did X, Y, and Z, or the mutants, or he would say, do you feel like going to see a show in D.C.? And I would say, I'm really not in the mood to mix with mutants right now. Mutants because they have no soul. They have no soul. I spoke to somebody who lived in L.A. for the longest time, and she said the same thing. She said in L.A., anybody who was at all told when they were growing up that they're good looking, well, they gravitate to L.A. So you have some of the best looking people in the country in L.A. But when you mix with them, do you think, oh, this is such a sexually dynamic place. It's vibrant. It's alive. No, it's like D.C. When I went to D.C., I thought D.C. would be very intellectually stimulating, only to discover that it's boring because they're soulless. It's the same thing with L.A. She described the scene as everybody meets everybody else with an agenda. Which producer do you know? Do you know an actor? Do you know somebody working on a set? How can I use you to advance myself? And that mindset is corrosive. So that is the kind of worldview that is prevalent in Washington, D.C. That's the kind of environment in which Harry Reid blossomed. And also, there is money everywhere in Washington, D.C. Sometimes people say, wow, the Saudis are corrupting the government. It's the Chinese. No, the money is coming from every quarter. It's not just corporations, and it's not just one or two foreign nations. And I want to give you a couple of examples of experiences that I had. My husband and I, he was on the national desk at the Washington Times, and at one time we met then candidate for Croatian politics. Now you're talking about a small country in Eastern Europe. We met this man, Ivo Sanadar. He was not yet elected as the Prime Minister of Croatia. We met him as he was emerging. We had dinner with him. He was the leader of the HDZ party. And we met also his colleagues and one of his close advisors. We met a whole group of them. And they were very warm. We had a very warm dinner. We also exchanged ideas about Croatian politics. And essentially, it was an informal kind of an interview, doing background research. What kind of policies would he put into place were he to be elected? Well, following that very warm and friendly dinner meeting, my husband got a call while he was at the Washington Times. So he's there at the news desk, and he gets a call from one of the advisors that we had met that night. And the message was loud and clear. If my husband was willing to write favorable articles in D.C. at a major national paper on behalf of this rising star in Croatian politics, then he would be rewarded very handsomely for helping out. Essentially, a bribe was being offered. And my husband was outraged. He blew up on the phone right there in the newsroom and hung up on him. And this is a small example of what happens all the time. A small country in Eastern Europe that many Americans don't know much about, don't care much about. Articles written in D.C. in favor of this candidate would have been very helpful. And so here was an opportunity for my husband to make not just thousands, not just hundreds of thousands, but literally millions of dollars if he was willing to play ball. And if he was willing to play ball, just think about this for a moment, would the American people have ever known about this? Would you ever find out? You would never know. So when we talk about the corruption in D.C., it is because there is such an amassing of power. It is the center, not just of the U.S., but often of the world's eyes. And therefore, the temptations and the opportunities come from every direction. And I want to share another story. We also had the opportunity to dine with a very wealthy Chinese lady. This is somebody who reached out to my husband and I while we were working in D.C. She said that she was a fan, especially of my husband's work. She was a great supporter of conservative ideas. She and her family had suffered under the communist Chinese, and she would love to take us out to dinner just so she could tell us her story. Well, we were sort of intrigued by this whole thing. And before we went out to dinner, we did a lot of research on her, but we did accept her dinner invitation. It was a lavish dinner. We went to an extremely expensive restaurant. And we thought this was going to be the narration of her life story, which was very similar to the suffering that my husband's family had experienced under the communists in Eastern Europe. Instead, we quickly realized that what she wanted was a series of articles in the press to buttress her image. I don't want to give away her name, but she's well known, an extremely wealthy Chinese lady. And there's a cloud of suspicion that had been befallen upon her, and she wanted a series of flattering articles written. Well, when I quickly gathered what that dinner was about, I was livid. My temper was I just blew up at her. She had basically insinuated that if we played ball, diamonds would be mailed to me. So she looked to me and said that diamonds would come in the mail. Now, I want you to think about this. Had I accepted that, had my husband accepted that, would anybody ever know? No. And who would guess this rich Chinese lady with a very personal agenda for her own specific reputation. This is another small example. And in both cases, my husband and I were outraged and we stormed out and we said no, and we had ended that dinner abruptly, just like he had ended that conversation abruptly. And we learned from all of that to be very wary of who courts you in Washington, D.C., because they want something from you. They want to give you something in order to get something from you, and they want to compromise you. And all of this I share because I want the American people, those who have the good sense not to live in Washington, D.C., to understand what it's about. The corrosion is everywhere. It comes at people doing their jobs from almost every quarter. We, rooted in our deep Christian faith, having a vocation to serve the public, walked away from those offers of riches because our soul, our integrity, and our professional vocation is not for sale. But in D.C., that's the exception, not the rule. The rule is the behavior of people like Dirty Harry Reid. And when the GOP rallying cry is fire him, I say amen to that. You are listening to Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com, upholding values that will never, ever die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
You're listening to the best of American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
News of the day.
Mr. Zimmerman, have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
With values that never die.
There are certainly a lot of controversies or scandals brewing right now when it comes to the Obama administration.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Dealing with the federal government is not always high-tech, and it's not always user-friendly.
The stories that matter.
This is a massive escalation in the tension here in Egypt.
The issues that count.
I don't know why the media tries to make this into a sensation. We have never hidden the fact that we supply Syria with weapons.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
He's got the red, white, blue flying high on the farm. Semper Fi tattooed on his left arm. Spend a little more in the store.
Welcome to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. I am the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. I was away last week. I was in Arizona visiting family there. We got into a debate, the family did, as to whether or not the sun shines brighter in Phoenix and Scottsdale, that whole area. And I can tell you, the sun there is absolutely gorgeous. It is the most beautiful sun that I have ever seen. I do think it shines brighter. If you haven't been there, do go there to visit. One of the most beautiful places in the U.S. Had a great trip. And I am refreshed and ready to rock and roll here. Thank you for joining us. You know, everyone is talking about 2016. And one of the things we're discussing is, can anybody in the GOP field beat Hillary Clinton? And I think the answer to that question is very clear. Yes, Hillary Clinton can easily be beaten. And I'll tell you why from a conservative point of view. But even before I give you my point of view, listen to what a Democratic strategist had to say. There's a lot of rumblings, even within her own party, despite the fact that she blows away the field on the Democratic side. Nobody comes close to winning the Democratic nomination right now. She's in the high 60s, and the next contender, someone like Biden, is polling at 14% amongst Democrats. So she's really blowing the field. But the bigger question is, can she really sustain a withering attack by a strong GOP candidate if she becomes the candidate for the Democrats. And listen to what some liberals are saying. Roll it, Brittany.
I've heard from other Democratic strategists, including people close to the Clinton world, that they're worried about the State Department record, that they feel like there's nothing that's going to shine that brightly in a record filled with achievements, that there isn't anything that stands out that brightly to dominate her prospective campaign. So then you have, 5 or 6 years of basically no votes.
Well, let's take a look for a moment at Hillary's career. She was First Lady, and I think in many respects there's a lot there that can be used against her for being silent while Bill Clinton was preying upon women, abusing women, essentially. She basically was an enabler of that. She was a senator, which is basically a debating club. And then she became the Secretary of State, in which not only is there no grand doctrine or any one thing that you can point to and say, well, this is what Secretary Clinton did during her tenure that was really successful. In fact, not only does she not have anything to show for her time there, but there are actually 2 huge black marks upon her as Secretary of State. One is Benghazi, and that is going to haunt her till her dying day for what she didn't do to protect the compound as they were asking for security, and then for the cover-up that followed. And number 2, another big black stain on her record is the whole Russia reset, which we now see is a colossal failure and a colossal disaster. So she doesn't have a positive record to run on. And in fact, she's got these big black marks against her that can be used to completely destroy her credibility. In addition, she has been a spokesperson for reforming healthcare. And the healthcare reform that has gone down under Barack Obama is a failure. And that, too, can be used against her. So the list of negatives is really very large, and I don't think we've even begun to explore that. So I think she's a much, much weaker candidate than people think. Remember that it's far too early in the game to say. There was a time when Rudy Giuliani was considered the inevitable GOP candidate. There wasn't even any point in anybody running against him, and he got blown away in 2008 by other candidates. So it is far too soon to see just how badly her reputation can be damaged by a concerted attack upon her record. And I think with a concerted attack, there's so much negative there that the polling now is not representative of what it will be once all the ammunition against her is fully fired. But let's take a look for a moment at the GOP side. There's a new poll out that shows that in Iowa, there is one individual who now leads the field, and he is former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. He is now polling at the very top in Iowa with 14.7% among Republicans, and others trail him. There is Jeb Bush in second place at 10.7%. Rand Paul is close, running neck and neck with Jeb Bush. But essentially, you have former Governor Mike Huckabee leading the field. And in some national polls, he's also leading the field. So there's a split in the national polls between some showing that Governor Christie's at the top, and others showing that it is Mike Huckabee. Well, I want to turn for a moment to reflect a little bit on the GOP field. Let's look at why Mike Huckabee is resonating with the American people. I think there is one simple reason: conviction. This is a man who speaks with great clarity and tremendous conviction. In all my years in Washington, D.C., I saw many politicians, I met many of them, and I also listened to many of them speak. And I can tell you something about Governor Huckabee. When I first heard him speak in a room that was packed, he literally took my breath away. And I turned to my husband and I gasped. I said, wow, he's a star. There is something about him when he speaks. He is mesmerizing speaker. And he is mesmerizing because he doesn't use doublespeak. He's not ambiguous. He doesn't use Washington speak. He speaks clearly, concisely, and he speaks with one of my favorite words, moral authority. This is a man who is immersed in Christian thought. In fact, he attended a seminary. He was a pastor too. This is a man who is a deep, true Christian. I watch his show and I'm really impressed with his character. One time recently, he was reflecting upon what are his greatest achievements. And he said, his greatest achievement is that his children turned out okay. That to me is telling of it shows that his heart is in the right place. I think his judgment is very good. His heart is in the right place, and he's a man of courage in defending social conservatism. And I want to play a couple of clips that show you why he's so powerful. Here he is in Iowa defending the Bible. Roll it, Brittany.
I honestly don't care what people do personally in their individual lives, but I tell you, the reason when people say, well, why don't you just kind of get on the right side of history? I said, you got to understand, this for me is not about the right side or the wrong side of history. This is the right side of the Bible. And unless God rewrites it, edits it, sends it down with his signature on it, it's not my book to change. Folks, that's why I stand where I stand.
Simple words and affirming his Christian faith, but in a humble way. It's not his to change. It's not mine to change. It's not yours to change. When people debate me and say, I disagree with your position on this or that, I often say, look, don't take it up with me. I'm really low on the totem pole here. I'm a small messenger. I read the Bible. I try to interpret it. You got a problem with this moral code? Take it up with Jesus. Take it up with God. Take it up with the Bible. And I really like the way Huckabee defends himself, and this is so appealing to evangelicals across the country. Remember, had Mitt Romney just gotten more of the evangelicals to come out to vote, he would have beaten Obama in 2012. So I think Mike Huckabee will certainly galvanize the evangelical vote. And I think, too, there's also something else that I really, really like about him. I've gone on the record as saying I no longer identify myself as a Republican. I'm calling for the formation outright of the Christian Party of America. I think that's the only way we're going to get this country straight. I think we've got to put morality and culture and social issues first in order to fix all the other problems in our country. Because my analysis is this. Character always comes first. And as the American character deteriorates, so does everything else. And I think unless we put our Christian principles first, this decline in America will continue in perpetuity. Well, I want to play another clip now that Huckabee, he was interviewed by Laura Ingraham, and he also spoke so brilliantly on the issue of same-sex marriage. He attacked President Obama, and he used such surgical analysis, such precision. Again, if you listen closely, what drives this man's precise ability to argue? It's because he's so deeply rooted in his Christian faith. Listen to this.
Absolutely, Laura. And, the position that I hold is the position that Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden held in 2008. Barack Obama held it until 2012. And my question that I would love to pose to the president is this. Mr. President, please explain that when you said in 2008 at the Saddleback Church Forum that you stood for traditional marriage, and you did so because you were a Christian and because it's what the Bible taught, please answer. Were you lying then? Are you lying now? Or did the Bible get rewritten? And I'm just wanting somebody in the press to answer that honest question. I can't come up with another alternative of what could have happened. One of those three scenarios has to be the reason that he was feeling comfortable enough to change his mind. Now, if he just said, look, I just believe this because it's historic or it's traditional, that's not what he said. He said it was because of his Christian convictions. Does he have them or does he not? If one has them, they don't change depending on what the culture does. You don't take an opinion poll to come up with a new point of view.
Brilliant. He basically showed that the President of the United States changed his position on same-sex marriage simply because it was expedient. And this also calls into question the Christianity that he professed in the 2008 campaign. Because, as Huckabee said so brilliantly, Christian convictions don't change. It's the motto of this show. I uphold values that will never die. Sometimes more people like these values, and sometimes less people like these values. It doesn't matter. The values aren't going to change. They've been around for 2,000 years, and they'll continue to be around. The only question is, Who is going to adopt them and who is going to reject them? But that's an age-old question. That's an age-old question of salvation itself. But what I like about Huckabee is he doesn't accept the politically correct mantra. He doesn't accept the politically correct worldview. You can hear it in how he speaks. You can hear it in how he thinks. You can hear it in how he attacks the president. Brilliant and rooted in conviction and moral authority. And there's something else, too, that we have to say. I think when we're looking for the next leader of the Republican Party, we should disqualify the senators. I think you have to have a governing record. That means Senator Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, who everybody is buzzing about right now, I don't think they should even make the first cut. Because what are these two? They're just yappers. That's what senators are. They just talk and they cast votes. Now, are they good senators? Yes. Are they brilliant senators? Yes. Do they articulate their positions well? Yes. Are they doing a service to the party? Yes. But they have no executive experience. And when I argued against Barack Obama in 2008, I said we cannot elect this man because he doesn't have executive experience. And I'm going to be consistent when it comes to the GOP field. You want me to analyze the candidates that I think are worthy? Give me the governors. I want the next Republican candidate to be a former governor, who has a record, a long record that we can examine. When it comes to Governor Huckabee, we have a record. He was a long-serving governor of Arkansas. There are things in that record that I do not like, and we can talk about that another time. But at least he makes the first cut for me, which is he's a man of deep conviction, he's a man of true Christian faith, and he has executive experience. That's the kind of material we need to be looking at in order to win in the next election. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that are never, ever, ever gonna die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome back to American Heartland. You're listening to Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. You know, I'm extremely impressed with Reverend Franklin Graham. This is a man who speaks his mind regardless of where he is. On This Week with George Stephanopoulos, he was on the panel, and they had a panel in which the topic of homosexuality came up. And he was asked pointedly whether or not people of that persuasion would go to heaven. And his response, based on his strong Christian beliefs, he said, well, if they repent of their sin, they can go to heaven. And the rest of the panel looked at him almost astonished that he would have the courage, the composure to state his Christian convictions, regardless of where he was, even on ABC, even on a channel that is notorious for being politically correct. Well, recently in an interview, he has explained that Christians are being persecuted around the world and in the United States, and we're entering a new age of persecution. Listen carefully.
We do see it rising around the globe, no question about it, and it's frightening. We see the anti-Christian position in this country. We see so much of it coming out of the entertainment industry, especially in certain segments of the news media. Christians are being attacked, and it's just part of it. And we see now in Europe the anti-Semitism, no question, it's there. And we're living in a world that is changing, and it is frightening to see how quickly the world is changing. And I think we're going to see real persecution of Christians and Jews in the years to come.
And indeed, that is the case, because Christians are being persecuted at home by a very radical liberalism that is gaining ascendancy. And there's also the danger around the globe, and the facts are that radical Islamists are persecuting Christians around the globe. And these two movements are not in abeyance. In fact, they're in ascendance. And so it's clear that Christians are entering an age of persecution. It's astonishing that in a society where it was Christians who were once dominant, they're now being pushed to the margins and increasingly ostracized. So much so that many Christians cower in their Christian beliefs. They don't want others to know what they truly believe. And that is especially true in states that are predominantly liberal, where there are just a minority of Christians and conservatives. Then they feel the need all the more to keep their convictions hidden. Well, listen to the advice that the Reverend has for all of us.
Well, I would encourage Christians not to back down, to stand firm, to share your faith, to stand for your faith, not to be afraid of the secularist who will scoff at you. We live in a world where we want to be politically correct. We live in a world where people want to be accepted. And standing for Jesus Christ, you're not going to be accepted in some circles. And you just have to be willing to accept that. And but don't be afraid. And I would encourage Christians to stand and be proud of your faith, and not to be shy, but to tell others about what God has done for you, what Christ did when he died on the cross and rose from the grave. Let people know that. I think that's extremely important.
You know, I was astonished as a professor. Sometimes I would ask students some basic questions like, could anybody recite the 10 Commandments? And they wouldn't even know what they were. In one instance, I had an exercise where with a group of 30 students, I said, let's put the 10 Commandments on the board. And I would start with one student and say, list one. And we would go down. And we would almost come to the very end of the class before we got all 10. Sometimes I would ask students, do you have any religious education at all? Have you been taught religion in the home? Show me by a show of hands. Obviously, this would be when we'd be talking about historical topics. I was teaching on the rise of Christianity or some such topic in world history or European history. I would use it as a vehicle to gauge the background of these students also. And I was stunned that you now have, in some cases, no exposure to religion whatsoever. So what the Reverend is saying is, sometimes by speaking up, you're actually going to speak about your faith to somebody who knows nothing about religion at all. Sadly, one of my best friends is going down this road. She is not a very devout Christian. She married a Muslim. And so they decided that the child is going to choose their faith when the child grows up. Well, you know what that means? The child's going to have very little exposure to any faith and likely to simply think that no religion really matters that much. Because if it mattered, then the parents wouldn't have given her a choice. She certainly had no choice as to whether or not she would eat her vegetables. So what the Reverend is saying is use opportunities to discuss the faith, to discuss your principles instead of the opposite. Because if we do the opposite, if we back down, if we keep our faith hidden, the pattern, it's only going to go in one direction. And that is the increasing ostracization and marginalization of everything that we hold dear. But you know, I think we need to be much more bold in the profession and the expression of our faith. One time, I was intrigued by a caller who called into a talk radio show and said, we should have Christian pride parades. I like that idea. I think it's time for that. You know, in the Italian villages, you see these processions that take place on the feast days. I used to kind of mock those when I was growing up. I still thought they were kind of primitive and kind of silly. I didn't get it. Now I get it. Now I think maybe we should have some of those in the big cities across America. Why don't we have Christian pride? They have gay pride. We have parades for just about everything. We have parades when somebody wins the Super Bowl, for crying out loud. When a team wins a sporting event, which frankly I care nothing about. I don't care what state wins what championship. And yet, we should think about Christian pride parades. One time I heard a sermon in my church saying we should wear the crucifix. We used to all wear crucifixes. And not just as a matter of fashion, the way Madonna wears it, the way some of these celebrities wear it, as though it's something trendy that in their real life they desecrate by their degenerate values, but wear it as a symbol of who we are and what we believe. But I think there's no question about it. If we truly want to see Christianity thrive, there is one thing that we all really need to do. It's not just talk about the faith, but it's to embody the faith values. It's to embody the gentleness. It's to embody the love. It's to embody the self-sacrifice that we are called to exercise as Christians. And I'd like to go a step further and say I would love to see the revival of the saints. Not just that we call upon the young to be Christians, but to be great Christians, to be as the saints, to embody the ideals in their purest, most profound, and most sincere form that they possibly can. Enough of all of this corruption and the color gray. I'm tired of the gray. I'm tired of the black. What I want to see is the pure white embodied in our youth, the pure white of the Christian faith. And the more we do that, the more we champion that, the more likely we will not be on the defensive, but our values and our faith will shine brightly for all to see and all to embrace. This is Dr. Grace, upholding values that are never going to die.
Well, if you ask me where I come from, here's what I tell everyone. I was born by God's dear grace.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
You're listening to the best of American Heartland with Dr. Grace.